The Coyotes had gone through a half-decade in hockey's purgatory thus far, always coming up just short of taking the next step to being true contenders. The move from downtown Phoenix to the new Glendale Arena at Westgate also signaled a shift into a complete rebuild for the team. It seemed like everything was brand new with the organization. A new arena, a new captain, the loss of old faces, and a brand new look. Gone were the NHL's most unique look in the black Kachina jerseys, replaced with the maroon Howling Coyote head and Sedona red jerseys. These jerseys were well received, albeit they were a disappointing departure from the originality with their original look. During the 2003 offseason, Captain Teppo Numminen was traded to the Dallas Stars. The captaincy would finally be handed down to Shane Doan. Coming off a 78-point season in 02-03, there was not much optimism for the future of the team. While Shane Doan was further rounding his game, the rest of the roster lacked the depth and star power to be anything but a bottom feeder. The team started off poorly, but managed to stay around 500 by mid-December. While the team was supposed to start the season in their new arena, construction delays continued to push the date further and further back. The Coyotes started the season at America West Arena, even after rebranding to their new uniforms, but thankfully it was short-lived. The first game in Glendale Arena history was on December 27, 2003, a Coyotes loss against the Nashville Predators. For all the surrounding circumstances and surrounding farmland around the stadium, the fans still showed up, and the arena itself was state-of-the-art. The team even had a new goal horn, which sounded great even if the change from Werewolves of London to crowd chant was a bit bland. The Coyotes had a small winning streak after the move, propelled by an incredible shutout streak by Brian Boucher. He recorded 5 consecutive shutouts to begin the 2004 calendar year, ending with a monumental 332 consecutive minutes without a goal allowed, which shattered the previous NHL record by over 30 minutes. The good times would not last long, however, as the team began to crater in the standings once this feel-good story was over. After a 1-1 tie against the lowly Mighty Ducks in February, the Coyotes decided to part ways with coach Bobby Francis. This unfortunately was the only NHL gig that Coach Francis would get, and interim coach Rick Bowness would lead the team the rest of the way, only winning 2 of their last 20 games. For their tanking efforts at the end of the season, the Coyotes were awarded the 5th pick in the 2004 draft despite having fewer wins than the top 2 selectors, Washington and Pittsburgh. Missing out on Alexander Ovechkin and Evgeny Malkin, the Coyotes went to select Blake Wheeler 5th overall. While Blake Wheeler would have a great NHL career, it would not come in a Coyotes uniform, as he opted to return to college and wouldn't begin pro play until 2008 with the Boston Bruins. On September 16, 2004, just one day before the expiration of the collective bargaining agreement, a lockout was initiated. Both sides could not agree on terms throughout 2004, and the entire 2004-05 season was cancelled as a result. The lockout could not have come at a worse time for the Coyotes, as they had only just moved into Glendale 5 months prior. The arrival in Glendale was already unceremonious, with the stadium just being left alone in a sea of farmland. Attendance was strong at the new arena in 2004, which makes the timing of this lockout even more devastating. We lost an entire season of hockey in 04-05, and this would have been the Coyotes' first full season in Glendale. The organization had been banking on this exact season to recoup the losses that had been mounting since the team moved to Phoenix, but instead they just had to sit idly by as the hype for the new arena died alongside the doomed 2004-05 season. The 2005 draft lottery had to use a different formula considering there was no season to base the odds on. Teams that missed the playoffs from 2001 to 2004 would receive 3 lottery balls. 2 lottery balls went to teams that appeared one time in that span, and only 1 ball for teams that appeared multiple times. The Coyotes fit into the second category, in the same group as teams like the Ducks, Hurricanes, and Wild, who appeared in the playoffs one time in that 3-year period. The Coyotes were expected to pick somewhere between 7 and 10, but found themselves falling all the way down to 17. For reference, those teams I just mentioned, they ended up with picks 2 through 4. Pick 5 went to Montreal, who only had 1 ball, and they used the pick on the future of their franchise, Carey Price. The Coyotes ultimately were able to make the most out of their pick by selecting Martin Hansel, a large frame center whose grit complemented that of Shane Doan. As the lockout ended in 2005, Wayne Gretzky made the move to become the team's next head coach while still retaining his share of ownership. This was Gretzky's first attempt at coaching, but it was widely assumed he would be naturally good at it. He was the great one, after all. The Coyotes had absolutely no prospects to develop, so they decided to go the complete opposite direction. With so much of the league shifting to a youth focus, the Coyotes attempted to half-heartedly compete with a bunch of old guys. To replace Sean Burke, the team signed 38-year-old Curtis Joseph to fill the gap. They even signed a 41-year-old Brett Hull. That surely will bring in the results. The team actually got out to a strong start, sitting 1 point from a playoff spot after a win in Boston on December 11th. It was at this point, however, that the team began to pile on the losses. Perhaps the lowlight for the team during the Gretzky era came on January 16, 2006, when Alexander Ovechkin scored an incredible goal on Brian Boucher in a blowout loss. This came during the team's worst stretch of the season, where they were routed regularly. The Coyotes finished the season with 81 points, just barely under 500. Even though this was an improvement over last season on paper, this was largely a result of inflated point totals across the league, as the Coyotes finished 14 points away from a playoff spot. The team lacked any sort of youth going forward as well, so a 500 finish in what was seen as a last gasp for relevancy for the team was a major disappointment. The 2006-07 season was more of the same, with Shane Doan leading the team in scoring, followed by journeymen and young players that couldn't cut it anywhere else. The team's identity issues continued to get worse, as they doubled down on their aging reputation by bringing back Jeremy Roenick for the season. After all, why develop new talent when there's Howling head Jeremy Roenick jerseys to sell? With a now 39-year-old Curtis Joseph still being the team's top goaltender, the team got out to a predictably terrible start. They weren't just losing, in their first month of play they had more 4+ goal losses than total victories. At this point, the Coyotes had committed to being a sideshow. A random streak of competency in December saved the team from an embarrassing record, but the 06-07 Coyotes had just 67 points over the season, which was their lowest total since moving to Phoenix. At least the next season wasn't cancelled this time, and the Coyotes were able to select Kyle Turris 3rd overall in 2007. Curtis Joseph finally had enough of this whole situation in Glendale and went up to Calgary for one last shot at a cup before retirement. Even with some youth finally seeing ice time in the form of Keith Yandle and Martin Hansel, Coach Gretzky could never get anything more than mediocrity out of his squad. General manager Mike Barnett was let go after this rock-bottom season, and would be replaced by Don Maloney. The team's uniforms underwent a slight yet very noticeable change this season, with the piping along the bottom of the jersey being removed and replaced with a red collar. Unfortunately, on the ice, it was time for yet another slow start under Wayne Gretzky. The low point of the season came in early November, where they played the Sharks 3 times in a row and lost by a combined score of 15-1. To a certain extent, it seemed like this embarrassment woke the team up a bit, as they actually rebounded to play some of their best hockey under Gretzky for the next few months. That's not saying much, though, but the Coyotes hung around 500 and were fighting for an outside shot at a playoff spot in January. Shane Doan expanded his playmaking ability and had a career-high 50 assists, most of which were to free agent acquisition Radim Vrbata. The biggest surprise of the season was definitely Peter Mueller. The 19-year-old center that was drafted just the season prior ended up playing 81 games on the season, and ended up 3rd on the team in points. The only 2 players that played more games, defensemen Keith Ballard and Derek Morris, helped anchor team defense in a way that hadn't been seen in years. Ilya Bryzgalov, the team's new goalie acquired from Anaheim, also shined with a .921 save percentage. Regardless, the team's lack of depth scoring kept them 8 points from a playoff spot and extended the drought to 5 seasons. But for once, the team looked like they were actually beginning to have a future. This season saw the first alternate jersey for the team since their move to Glendale. This black jersey featured a running coyote and prominently featured the sand coloring of the Howling head logo in the piping. Radim Vrbata left the team in free agency, and his absence was felt, even after trading for Olli Jokinen. While they started off the season above 500, the losses quickly started piling up before the end of December. Their record never got too terrible, but it was clear that they did not have a very high ceiling. Besides Doan and Jokinen, this team just could not get anything done offensively. Some of the team's youth continued to make strides, such as Kyle Turris and Mikkel Bodker, but the team was obviously not moving in the right direction under Gretzky. The nail in the coffin was a noticeable step back from Brizgalov and team defense, which caused the team to fall back down to 79 points and extend the playoff drought to 6 seasons. At this point, it was clear that this team was fundamentally flawed, and it wasn't just the ineffective coaching of Wayne Gretzky. The ownership was entirely disinterested in hockey as a sport, and the roster suffered greatly for it. Even the team's advertising was noticeably low budget. Their ad campaign from around this time centered around Pierre the Fanatic Hockey Snowman. The ads are plenty of fun, but it's clear they were trying to make the best out of a bad situation. Even the most resilient of markets would be struggling to draw in fans under these circumstances, but the situation in Glendale was truly a disaster without comparison. Steve Ellman's decision to not build an arena on the site that he already owned in Scottsdale, and instead buying cheap farmland in Glendale for Westgate, was cataclysmic for the team. The poor location was one thing, but the actual development of the land might have been even more troubled. While the arena itself opened in 2003, construction on the rest of Westgate didn't even begin until 2005. From there, it would still be an entire year until the first shops around the arena opened. This meant from 2003 to 2006, this new entertainment district was hinging entirely on the Coyotes for revenue, and as you remember, there was an entire season canceled in the middle of that. The sheer number of factors going against this move to Glendale, combined with a terrible on-ice product and an impending recession, created a perfect storm for this team to bleed money like no team had before. Around this time in 2006, Steve Ellman sold his interest in the team to minority owner Jerry Moyes. Moyes actively had no interest in hockey and immediately tried to pass off the team to anybody else that would buy them. He was willing to sell to anybody, regardless of their plans for the team, and showed absolutely no respect towards the NHL and its rules. This dynamic continued through 2007 and into early 2008, at which point Jerry Moyes announced that he would no longer be providing funds to the team. Because a hockey team obviously needs money to operate, the NHL had no choice but to take control of hockey operations from Moyes in 2008. While Moyes retained ownership for the time being, both parties were desperate to find a group to buy the team. By May 2009, the league was prepared to make a formal bid with a group led by Jerry Reinsdorf. Despite Reinsdorf being the owner of the Chicago Bulls and White Sox, he stated his intentions on keeping the Coyotes in Arizona. However, this deal was not favorable to Moyes, who already viewed the team as an annoyance and financial drain on top of several other companies he was in charge of. Mere hours before Bettman could officially make the offer with Reinsdorf, Jerry Moyes decided to declare bankruptcy for the entire organization. Along with this awesome bankruptcy move, Moyes announced his intent to sell the team to Jim Balsillie. At this point, Balsillie was infamous around the league for attempting to buy teams and move them to his hometown of Hamilton, Ontario. He failed to buy the Penguins, the Predators, and now he was hoping the third time would be the charm with the Coyotes. On July 29th, the NHL Board of Governors rejected this ownership bid from Balsillie by a vote of 29-1, the one vote, of course, being a representative from Jerry Moyes. Even with this resounding defeat by the NHL Board of Governors, Moyes kept the circus going for several months by claiming the NHL was violating antitrust laws by not letting him sell to his preferred partner. These claims were baseless and went nowhere. When it was all said and done, the Coyotes were sold to the NHL for $140 million. Beyond the economics, the team took a massive hit to its reputation during this time. While many fans across the league remembered the days of Roenick and Tkachuk, the financial reality of the franchise became common knowledge. The narrative quickly became one in which the reason the Coyotes were failing financially was because the team had no fans and that hockey didn't belong in the desert. This certainly wasn't helped by the NHL being in control of the team, which is still often seen as them propping up a failed project. It's worth remembering, though, that while the Coyotes' attendance has never been that strong, it's never been some sort of negative outlier. In 2007, a year where they lost a projected $45 million, they had a higher average attendance than 6 other teams, including the Blackhawks and the Bruins. Needless to say, the reason for this team's financial failure can be put squarely on the shoulders of Steve Ellman and Jerry Moyes. Ellman should have never been a serious bidder for an NHL franchise in the first place, and his blindsiding of Scottsdale residents in 2001 set the organization down this disastrous path. The ship could have been righted, but he just had to sell to the guy that couldn't get the other half of Westgate built in 3 years. And while Ellman would get the rest of Westgate done by 2009, Jerry Moyes was busy running the Coyotes into the ground. His outright hostility towards the NHL and refusal to operate the team as a proper owner plunged the team into a spiral that they never truly recovered from. As the story continues, it's important to remember the sheer numbers involved in this bankruptcy. In Jerry Moyes' 3 seasons as owner, the team lost $73 million and $45 million in 2008-09 alone. The team continued to lose money after cutting Moyes loose, but that figure would never come close to those catastrophic figures. With the NHL's takeover of the team, Wayne Gretzky finally stepped down as head coach. Gretzky had been a part owner alongside Steve Ellman, and was now no longer affiliated with the team in any way. Dave Tippett would take over the team, and despite the noise behind the scenes, the Coyotes began finding success in a new identity. Tippett's gritty style of coaching was exactly what a roster lacking star power needed all along. Even though Shane Doan's production slowed down, he was still the team's top scorer with 55 points. His supporting cast finally started to come into their own, with great seasons from Radim Verbata and Matthew Lombardi. The Coyotes had become a legitimate threat in the Western Conference for the first time since moving to Glendale, and was finally back on the hockey map after years of disappointment. The biggest story of the season was Ilya Bryzgalov, who rebounded to finish second in Vezina voting with a 2.29 goals against average. The team finished with 107 points, which easily became the franchise record. After 7 seasons of floating around aimlessly, the Coyotes had finally broken the playoff drought. The reward for such a strong season was a date with the Detroit Red Wings in the first round. The Red Wings were fresh off back-to-back finals appearances, sporting Datsuk and Zetterberg in their primes. The Coyotes had home ice advantage in the series, and the whiteout was in full force for the first time in Glendale. The Coyotes rode the raucous crowd to a tight Game 1 victory, but a Zetterberg hat-trick in Game 2 would send the series back to Detroit tied 1 game apiece. The Coyotes surprisingly went into Joe Louis Arena and won Game 3 before being shut out 2 nights later. In the all-important Game 5 in Glendale, the Coyotes just could not get past Jimmy Howard in a 4-1 loss. With their backs against the wall, Dave Tippett and company went back to Joe Louis Arena and stunned the Detroit crowd by winning 5-2 in Game 6. This was a familiar situation for the Coyotes, only needing 1 more home win to advance to the second round for the first time since moving to Phoenix. In a throwback to their days at America West Arena, the Coyotes played a strong yet scoreless first period. And continuing with that throwback, the team absolutely imploded in the second period. Pavel Datsuk scored twice in a 2-minute span to begin the period, and although the Coyotes got one back, Detroit was clearly in the driver's seat at this point. Nicholas Lidstrom would score on the power play soon after, and Detroit would cruise to a 6-1 dominant win in the decisive Game 7. It was a hard-fought 7-game series, but it ultimately just wasn't meant to be. Bryzgalov could only keep the potent Detroit offense at bay for so long, and the levee broke halfway through Game 7. It was disappointing that they couldn't seal the deal on home ice and win their first playoff series in Arizona, but there's no shame in going the distance against the late 2000s Red Wings. After being shoved into the basement in their first half-decade in Glendale, the Coyotes finally had an identity under Dave Tippett. They played hard-nosed old-school hockey, and their stout defense gave their goaltenders an edge regardless of who it was. GM Don Maloney was recognized for his achievements in rebuilding the roster, and was the recipient of the first General Manager of the Year award in 2010. The 2010-11 season did see a slight regression for the team, but the roster was still intact and playing their brand of hockey. Team scoring stayed consistent, even with top center Matthew Lombardi moving on to Nashville before the season. To replace Lombardi, journeyman Ray Whitney joined the team, and showed no signs of slowing down even at age 38. The team started off their season in Prague, where they split a 2-game series against the Boston Bruins. As they returned to America, the Coyotes showed some jet lag with a below 500 start to the season. Thankfully, though, they gained momentum as the season carried on, and they found themselves on the winning end of several one-goal games down the stretch. At some random point in the middle of the season, the team adopted a new goal song. Howlin' for You by the Black Keys was brand new at the time, and while several teams adopted the song into their rotation of stadium jams, the song was the perfect fit for the Coyotes' goal song. Brizgalov had another excellent season in net, but didn't receive the same attention for it. Keith Yandle was already one of the better defensemen in the league, and his 48 assists this season propelled him to the top of the conversation. He finished 5th in Norris voting, above the likes of Chris Letang and Duncan Keith. The team would finish with 99 points, good enough for the 6th seed and a date with the Detroit Red Wings. This matchup would not resemble the hard-fought series from a year prior. Detroit had a 3-goal period 3 separate times en route to a sweep. The Coyotes were never blown out in this short series, but it was clear that this current core needed a shakeup to get past their own demons. During the offseason, the Coyotes shipped Brizgalov to Philadelphia for a 3rd-round pick. While he could get the job done in the regular season, his shaky playoff performances left the team yearning for more. Less than a month later, former Tampa Bay backup Mike Smith joined the team. Smith was named Rookie of the Year for goaltending back in 2007 for the Stars, but struggled to keep consistent starting time afterwards. Aside from the addition of Smith, it was most of the same squad rolling into the next season. During the 2011 offseason, the Atlanta Thrashers were suddenly relocated to Winnipeg, officially bringing back the Winnipeg Jets brand. The history of the original Jets would remain with the Coyotes, however. The Thrashers' play-by-play announcer, Matt McConnell, would join the Coyotes' broadcast booth, joining former Coyote Tyson Nash. The Coyotes started the season off relatively mediocre, but were still fighting for a playoff spot in a very competitive Western Conference. It was clear from the get-go that the team had fixed up issues defensively, to the point where their blue line was generating a lot of their offense. Keith Yandle and 20-year-old Oliver Ekman-Larsson always managed to get the puck on the net and create chaos in the crease. While Ekman-Larsson debuted in the previous season, this was undoubtedly his breakout year. The team had slowly slid from a playoff spot in mid-January, but they returned from the All-Star break with new determination. They won 11 of their 12 games in February, with the lone loss coming in a shootout against the eventual President's Trophy winners in Vancouver. During this winning streak, the Coyotes traded for Antoine Vermette to make up some sorely needed center depth. Mike Smith came into town with his now iconic Wile E. Coyote mask and had the season of his life. A .930 save percentage, 2.21 goals against average, and a spot as a Vezina finalist. Smith's excellent numbers and fiery personality made him an instant fan favorite in Phoenix and a new face of the franchise. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for through the years in Dallas and Tampa, and he was not letting it go to waste. Ray Whitney was the star of the show on offense, putting up 77 points at age 39. Nobody could have seen this coming. Whitney looked like he was on his way to retirement after a poor previous season. The Coyotes finished the year with 97 points, which was fewer than last year, but good enough for first in the Pacific Division. This put them in an interesting 3-6 matchup with the Chicago Blackhawks, who had more points than the Coyotes yet did not win their division. Game 1 was a shooting frenzy for both sides, with Jonathan Toews getting on the board first for Chicago. Payet and Vermette would strike back in the second to give Phoenix the lead that they would take deep into the third. With only 15 seconds left in the game, Brent Seabrook beats Mike Smith and sends the game to overtime. The Blackhawks would come out swinging in overtime, but Smith continued to be a brick wall and denied any chances. The Coyotes had a face-off in the offensive zone halfway through the period, and a deflection from Martin Hanzal gave the Coyotes a 1-0 lead in the series. Game 2 was eerily similar, with Chicago taking an early lead and Phoenix clawing back to take the lead going into the third. Once again, the third period was scoreless until a Chicago shot found its way in with under a minute to play, once again involving Brent Seabrook. The Blackhawk offense was just too strong to hold in overtime, however, as Brian Bickle evened up the series going back to Chicago. Game 3 started off on a very sour note. Midway through the first period, fourth liner Rafi Torres laid out a reckless and devastating hit to Chicago star Marian Hossa. Hosso would need to be lifted off the ice in a stretcher, and somehow Torres avoided any penalty for the hit in the game itself. After some heated exchanges, both teams would cool down a bit after the hit, and the trend of the series would continue. Chicago scored first for the third game in a row deep into the first period. The 1-0 score would hold until a quick barrage in the third period for both teams, first with Rusty Klesla tying the game up. Just over 30 seconds later, Michael Frolik returned the lead back to Chicago. And another 30 seconds after that, Ray Whitney finds the back of the net to tie the game back up. For the third game in a row, we would need overtime. Chicago would dominate most of the puck possession in overtime, but a weird angle shot from Mikhail Bodkar was all that Phoenix needed to go up in the series. Torres would be suspended for the rest of the playoffs for his idiotic hit, which cost the Coyotes some much-needed physicality. Game 4 would flip the script, as neither team could score in the first or second periods. Chicago dominated possession, but they just could not get past Mike Smith. The third period saw two Coyotes goals within a minute of each other from Doan and Pyatt. Something about these two goals woke Chicago up, however, as they would tie the game back up and send us to a fourth straight overtime. Once again, Chicago mostly dominated the possession, but a breakaway by Bodkar resulted in maybe the softest goal that Corey Crawford has ever given up, and gave Phoenix a commanding 3-1 series lead. After suffering two close losses at home at the hands of Mikhail Bodkar, Chicago would come into Jobbing.com Arena ready to leave it all on the ice. Phoenix would strike first in the second period, but in the third, Nick Leddy was finally able to beat Smith to tie the game. It was now time for the fifth straight overtime game of the series. This one would only last for about 3 minutes, however, as Jonathan Toews was able to bury it to keep Chicago's hopes alive. Game 6 in United Center was Mike Smith's magnum opus, meeting all of Chicago's pressure and recording a 39-save shutout to ice the series on the road. A bit of an anticlimactic ending for Chicago fans. Chicago had nearly 100 more shots in this series than Phoenix did, but the brick wall of Mike Smith put up a .950 save percentage and put the team on his back. More importantly, this victory finally meant that the playoff curse was over. The team had finally won a playoff series for the first time in 8 tries since moving to Arizona 15 years prior. The monkey was finally off their back and they could look forward to the next round. Thankfully, round 2 would not be against the Detroit Red Wings, but rather the Nashville Predators. On paper, they seemed like the better version of this Coyotes team. Pekka Rinne finished right above Mike Smith in Vezina voting, and their offense was more potent with the likes of Martin Erat and David Legwand. Game 1 was a very direct continuation of the Blackhawks series, with the teams going back and forth and eventually reaching the end of regulation tied 3 apiece. It was time for overtime once again. 14 minutes into the extra period, Martin Hanzal won the face-off and Ray Whitney buried it to give the Coyotes the Game 1 victory. Game 2 finally saw the Coyotes' offense wake up as they outshot the Preds en route to a convincing 5-3 win. Pekka Rinne and the entire Nashville defense strengthened up and reminded everybody why they were originally favored in this series in Game 3. Rinne recorded a 32-save shutout, and the Preds took a game on their home ice even with the Coyotes dominating possession. Game 4 was similarly tight, with Shane Doan giving the Coyotes an early lead in the first period. There wasn't much offense to speak of after this, and Mike Smith would hold on to that lead with a 25-save shutout. Up 3-1, the Coyotes returned home on the verge of their first conference finals appearance. This felt truly surreal. They had Nashville completely on the ropes, and this was the first time that most Coyotes fans felt confident in the team closing things out. Nashville would not go quietly into the night and attacked Smith relentlessly. The Great Wall stayed intact, and we remained scoreless until Shane Doan kicked out a pass to Derek Morris, who blew it right past Rinne. Martin Hanzal would score from the same spot 10 minutes later, and that's all she wrote. The Preds would score in the third period, and certainly gave Smith some true tests, but the Coyotes would emerge victorious. They were off to the conference finals for the first time in franchise history. The Coyotes looked good enough to play for the Stanley Cup, which was a strange sentence to write, and it's honestly even weirder saying it out loud now. The offense was just potent and hard-hitting enough to complement Mike Smith's incredible goaltending. Even though they defeated the Predators in 5 games, their opponent for the conference final was already determined. The Los Angeles Kings were an 8 seed, and they were in the midst of the most impressive and unexpected playoff run in the modern era. Goaltender Jonathan Quick finished second in Vezina voting, and likewise stole the show in the opening round as the Kings stunned the one-seed Vancouver Canucks in 5 games. The Kings' offense got a jolt in the second round as they demolished the hopes and dreams of the St. Louis Blues in a sweep. These two teams were on a collision course for each other. They played a very similar brand of hockey, they were division rivals, and neither had a Stanley Cup to speak of. It was the most bizarre matchup in the conference finals, and a very fitting meeting for such a chaotic postseason. The Kings may not have been as miserable as the Coyotes, but they themselves had not advanced in the playoffs since 2001. Game 1 started off similarly to the rest of the Coyotes' playoff run, with the teams going back and forth scoring through the first 2 periods. Once the third period came, however, the Kings would put their foot on the gas and drive away with a 4-2 win. The Coyotes continued to sputter in Game 2, getting shut out 4-0 at home off the back of a Jeff Carter hat trick. Quick barely had to do anything, netting a 24-save shutout. Frustration and bad blood between the teams was apparent, with this game beginning a trend of dirty hits from both teams and an often full penalty box. Tippett clearly was embarrassed with the team's performance in Game 2, and as the series shifted back to LA, we saw a return to the team's normal brand of hockey. Damon Langko gave the Coyotes their first lead of the series, but it was short-lived as the Kings responded just over 2 minutes later. Dwight King of the Kings scored quickly in the third, and the Coyotes could not muster enough chances to pull out of the hole. They were down 3-0 in the series, and for the first time in this postseason, the Coyotes were on the ropes and just waiting for the knockout blow. This message didn't quite get through to Shane Doan and Mike Smith, who possibly had their best performances in Game 4. Doan scored the only 2 goals in the game and led all forwards in ice time by a large margin. Smith would grab a 36-save shutout, and the brooms could be safely put away. Game 5 was an appropriate change in tone from the low-shot games in LA, and both goaltenders were under constant siege. Goals on both sides were flying in the first 2 periods, but we ultimately would arrive in the third all tied up. Dustin Brown did his characteristic, technically legal but still an asshole knee move to Michael Roosevelt. No penalties were declared, and the Kings would go on to win the series mere seconds after the ensuing face-off. And that's all she wrote. That was the pinnacle of the Coyotes hockey experience, getting embarrassed by Los Angeles on home ice in the conference finals. A bittersweet end to a miracle of a season that nobody who witnessed it will ever forget. At the time, it felt like this could be the start of something special, finally turning the page for the franchise. But just as the Coyotes had gained some momentum, the NHL was about to enter yet another lockout. The hype built from this deep playoff run was dashed, while the future of this franchise remained as uncertain as ever.